You didn't hear a crash. No alarms, no emergency press conference, no red banners on your phone. But while most of the world slept, something enormous shifted. Money moved. Quietly, relentlessly. On a scale so large it only becomes visible after the fact. Roughly $5 trillion changed hands, direction, or destiny. Not because of a war, not because of a virus, not because of a market panic, but because China changed the rules of its own game. And that matters more than most people realize. Because when the world's second largest economy rewrites incentives, it doesn't just affect China, it rewires global wealth itself. Here's why this story matters right now. For years, China ran on a simple bargain: grow fast, build everything, reward anyone who played along. Property developers borrowed freely. Local governments sold land like an ATM. Households poured savings into apartments they didn't need, trusting prices would only go up. Foreign investors chased returns, assuming Beijing would always protect growth. That system didn't crack overnight. It rotted slowly, then all at once. And when Beijing finally acted, it didn't look like a collapse. It looked like policy. That's what makes this dangerous. And fascinating. Let's rewind. For 2 decades, Chinese growth was powered by concrete. Real estate wasn't just housing. It was collateral. It was retirement. It was local government revenue. It was the engine under everything else. At its peak, property and related sectors made up close to 30% of China's economy. That's not a typo. Nearly 1 out of every 3 yuan depended on buildings. Apartments were sold before they were built. Developers used that money to buy more land. Local governments used land sales to fund services. Banks lent because prices kept rising. Households bought because there were no better options. Everyone knew it was fragile. Everyone assumed it would last. Until Beijing decided it wouldn't. The first signal wasn't dramatic. It was bureaucratic. Something called the 3 red lines. Limits on how much debt property developers could carry. Limits on borrowing. Limits on leverage. On paper, it sounded responsible. Even boring. In reality, it was a guillotine. Developers who had lived on endless credit suddenly couldn't refinance. Projects stalled. Cash dried up. Confidence evaporated. Evergrande didn't fail because it was unique. It failed because it was typical. And once property stopped being a one-way bet, the spell broke. Home prices flattened, then fell. Sales slowed, then froze. Households noticed. And here's where the wealth transfer begins. In China, most families don't own stocks. They own apartments, often multiple ones. When property stops rising, wealth doesn't just pause. It reverses. On paper, trillions of dollars in household net worth began to shrink. Not through a crash, through stagnation. That's a silent loss. The kind people don't riot over, but they feel it every day. Less spending, more saving, more fear. Beijing saw this and made another choice. If property can't be the engine anymore, something else has to be. So money was redirected, not asked, redirected. Credit flowed away from developers and toward manufacturing, toward advanced tech, toward electric vehicles, toward batteries, toward export industries. At the same time, regulators tightened control over internet platforms, education companies, gaming, anything seen as socially unproductive. Capital got the message. If you were invested in old China, you were exposed. If you aligned with new China, you were rewarded. This is where the 5 trillion number starts to make sense. Not as a single transaction, but as cumulative movement. Property values down. Developer bonds wiped out. Local government financing vehicles squeezed. Equities repriced. Foreign money pulling back. Domestic savings redirected into state-favored sectors and government bonds. Money didn't vanish. It changed owners. Changed vehicles. Changed purpose. Households lost paper wealth. The state gained control. That's the uncomfortable math. In most countries, when bubbles burst, governments rushed to reinflate them. China did the opposite. It chose discipline over comfort, control over confidence, long-term leverage over short-term pain. Or at least that's the official story. Because here's the irony. By trying to deflate one bubble carefully, China created pressure everywhere else. Local governments, cut off from land sales, struggled to pay debts. Banks rolled over loans quietly. State firms absorbed losses that never hit headlines. Growth slowed, even as factories expanded. To the outside world, it looked confusing. How can China be exporting deflation while building record numbers of factories? How can it talk about consumption while households save more than ever? The answer is trust. Wealth isn't just money. It's belief in tomorrow. And belief was damaged. Now zoom out. When China slows, it doesn't slow alone. Global commodity demand weakens. Luxury goods sales fall. Emerging markets tied to Chinese growth feel it. Foreign companies discovered their China exposure isn't optional. At the same time, Chinese exports surge, not because demand is booming, but because excess capacity has to go somewhere. That pushes prices down globally. Good for consumers, brutal for competitors. So while Chinese households quietly absorb losses, manufacturers in other countries feel the pressure. Another wealth transfer, different direction. And then there's capital markets. Foreign investors once treated China as inevitable. That assumption is gone. Money that once flowed automatically now hesitates. Some leaves, some demands higher returns, some never comes back. That repricing alone shifts trillions in global portfolios. Not in a day, over months, quietly. This is why the story didn't trend. There was no single moment, no Lehman weekend, no screaming charts, just a slow redistribution of risk and reward. Hype said China would either collapse or dominate. Reality did neither. It rebalanced, painfully, deliberately, and with consequences that are still unfolding. The biggest misconception is thinking this is over. Property hasn't fully cleared. Local debt hasn't been resolved. Household confidence hasn't recovered. At the same time, the new growth model hasn't proven it can replace the old one. Export-led manufacturing works until the world pushes back. And the world is starting to push back. Tariffs, subsidies, strategic industries. Everyone is drawing lines. Which raises the final uncomfortable question. If $5 trillion could move without panic, without headlines, without most people noticing, what happens when the next shift isn't quiet? Because the real lesson here isn't about China. It's about modern finance. Wealth no longer transfers only through crashes. It transfers through policy, through incentives, through silence. And by the time it feels obvious, it's already done. So the question isn't whether China triggered the biggest wealth transfer in history. It's whether the world is prepared for the next one. Because it probably won't announce itself either.